Have you ever noticed how some people never learned from school, even though they were capable of thinking deeply and understanding things in ways that never showed up on tests? And what if that refusal was not a lack of intelligence, but a psychological response to an environment that quietly pushed their curiosity away? Tonight, we explore the hidden patterns behind human behavior, learning, and the inner world people rarely talk about. If these reflections feel familiar to you, consider subscribing and staying with the journey. School rarely begins as something a person actively resists, because in the earliest years it appears simply as a place one is brought to. A room filled with chairs, routines, voices, and expectations that arrive already assembled, carrying with them an unspoken assumption that meaning will reveal itself in time, even though for some minds that meaning never quite forms, creating instead a faint but persistent sensation of standing slightly outside the experience, present in body, but not entirely included in thought. For these individuals, attention does not wander out of carelessness or incapacity, but out of a quiet recognition that what is being offered does not connect to anything internally alive. So words are heard, instructions are followed, symbols are repeated, yet nothing settles deeply enough to feel owned, and learning becomes something performed for survival rather than something absorbed for understanding, like memorizing directions to a place one never intends to visit. As days pass and routines harden, effort slowly detaches from curiosity. Because effort is rewarded only when it mirrors expectation, not when it explores. And over time, the act of trying begins to feel less like participation and more like compliance, a posture the mind can hold for only so long before it naturally seeks distance, not in open defiance, but in quiet withdrawal. This withdrawal is rarely noticed at first, because it does not disrupt the room, does not challenge authority, and does not announce itself loudly enough to demand intervention. Yet, internally, it begins to shape how the individual relates not only to school, but to the idea of learning itself, teaching them that understanding is secondary to correctness, and that thinking freely often carries more risk than reward. Within this environment, a particular kind of loneliness develops, one that comes not from isolation, but from constant exposure without recognition, from being surrounded by people while feeling internally unseen. And, as this loneliness settles in, curiosity does not disappear so much as it retreats, learning where it is safe to exist and where it is better kept hidden. Teachers, constrained by systems that measure success through visible output, may interpret this quiet distance as a lack of motivation or ability, while peers may read it as indifference. And slowly, these external interpretations begin to echo internally, shaping a self-image that feels increasingly incompatible with what learning is supposed to look like, even when the mind itself remains active, observant, and deeply engaged with the world in ways that never receive acknowledgement. What often goes unnoticed is that during this period, the mind is still learning continuously, though not along approved pathways, learning how to observe without participating, how to detach emotion from evaluation, how to protect attention from constant exposure, and how to endure environments that feel psychologically misaligned, skills that later appear as resistance, independence, or detachment, depending on who is watching. As this pattern repeats, school becomes less a place of exploration and more a structure to be endured, a sequence of obligations that exist outside the self. and the idea of learning gradually acquires an emotional weight, becoming associated with pressure, judgment, and artificial standards, rather than discovery or growth, making avoidance feel safer than engagement and withdrawal, feel more honest than pretending interest where none has ever been allowed to grow. Over time, this distance settles quietly into identity, not as a conscious belief, but as a background assumption, shaping how the individual approaches knowledge, authority, and effort long after the classroom has been left behind, reinforcing the sense that learning belongs elsewhere, in spaces that allow thought to move freely, without immediate evaluation or correction. By the time the refusal to learn from school becomes visible from the outside, it is no longer a moment of rebellion, but the natural outcome of years spent in an environment that never fully responded to the inner logic of a particular mind, leaving behind not a lack of intelligence, but a deeply conditioned separation between curiosity and structure that continues to influence how learning is approached in every context that follows. As the early distance from school settles into something familiar, a second layer begins to form beneath it, one that is harder to notice because it does not involve disengagement from thinking itself, but rather a growing realization that the way intelligence is measured and recognized within the classroom does not resemble how the mind actually moves, creating a quiet but persistent fracture between inner capability and external validation. For these individuals, understanding does not arrive in straight lines or neat sequences, but in sudden connections, abstract patterns, emotional associations, and moments of insight that resist immediate translation into answers. Yet school demands visibility, speed, and uniformity, rewarding those who can reproduce information quickly, while overlooking those whose thinking unfolds slowly, inwardly, or in ways that do not announce themselves on demand. This mismatch does not initially feel like failure, because the mind continues to work, continues to notice, continues to connect ideas in private, but over time the absence of recognition begins to erode confidence, not through direct criticism, but through silence, through the repeated experience of having one's way of understanding go unnoticed, unmeasured, and therefore unvalidated. As a result, intelligence starts to feel homeless, present but unsupported, active yet unacknowledged, and in this state, it gradually withdraws from formal spaces, not because it lacks strength, but because it lacks resonance, because it senses that revealing itself offers little reward and carries significant risk, especially when mistakes are penalized more harshly than originality is rewarded. Within the structure of school, intelligence is often treated as something to be displayed rather than something to be developed, a performance that must conform to predetermined shapes, and for minds that do not naturally think in those shapes. Each attempt to participate becomes an act of translation, a constant effort to compress complex internal understanding into simplified external forms that never quite capture what is actually happening inside. This process is exhausting, and exhaustion gradually turns into avoidance, not as an act of rebellion, but as a form of self-preservation. Because when every expression of thought feels inadequate or misinterpreted, silence begins to feel safer than exposure, and disengagement begins to feel more authentic than constant adaptation. What makes this particularly misunderstood is that many of these individuals are deeply capable of learning, often intensely so. But their learning thrives in environments that allow time, ambiguity, emotional relevance, and internal pacing, elements that are often incompatible with standardized systems designed to move entire groups at once, regardless of individual rhythm. As the years pass, this incompatibility begins to shape belief, slowly constructing the idea that intelligence itself is conditional, that it exists only when recognized by authority, and that unrecognized understanding may as well not exist at all. A belief that quietly undermines confidence and discourages effort, even when curiosity remains alive beneath the surface. In response, some minds turn inward, nurturing their intelligence privately through observation, imagination, and self-directed exploration, while others gradually disengage altogether, concluding not that they are incapable of learning, but that learning, as defined by school, is not meant for them, a conclusion that feels logical, protective, and deeply personal. This is where refusal takes on a new shape, no longer rooted in early emotional distance, but in a growing awareness that the system does not have a place for certain forms of thinking. And when intelligence cannot find a home, it either adapts beyond recognition or chooses to leave, carrying its curiosity elsewhere, into spaces where it is allowed to exist without constant justification. By this stage, the separation between the individual and formal learning has become more than situational. It has become structural, influencing how effort is invested, how authority is perceived, and how self-worth is measured, laying the foundation for a lifelong relationship with knowledge that remains deeply shaped by these early experiences of being unseen. As intelligence drifts further away from recognition, another tension quietly takes its place, one that has less to do with learning itself and more to do with power, control, and the unspoken rules that govern who gets to decide what knowledge is worth having. Because for many people, the refusal to learn from school is not a rejection of ideas, but a reaction to the way authority presents itself as unquestionable, fixed, and emotionally distant. In classrooms, authority often arrives disguised as neutrality, wearing the language of structure and order. Yet, beneath this surface, it carries a rigid expectation of obedience that leaves little room for negotiation, curiosity, or personal meaning. And for certain minds, this expectation is immediately felt as constriction, not because discipline is inherently oppressive, but because it is imposed without dialogue, without context, and without regard for how understanding actually forms within the individual. For these individuals, the problem is not being guided, but being managed, not being taught, but being directed. And over time, this distinction becomes impossible to ignore, as every instruction feels less like an invitation to explore and more like a command to comply, slowly transforming learning into an act of submission rather than engagement. This dynamic creates a subtle but powerful resistance, one that does not always appear as confrontation or misbehavior, but as a quiet refusal to invest emotionally in a system that does not acknowledge autonomy, because when thinking is constantly corrected before it is understood, and curiosity is redirected before it is allowed to unfold, the mind begins to protect itself by withholding participation altogether. What is often misunderstood is that this resistance is not rooted in arrogance or disrespect, but in a deeply human need for agency, for the sense that one's inner process matters. And when that need is consistently denied, learning becomes associated not with growth, but with loss, the loss of voice, of ownership, and of authenticity. As authority tightens its grip through grading, comparison, and constant evaluation, the individual learns that mistakes are not simply part of learning, but public markers of inadequacy, and this awareness introduces a quiet fear into the process, one that reshapes behavior long before it is consciously recognized, making experimentation feel dangerous and originality feel risky. In response, some people adapt by mastering the art of appearing compliant while remaining internally detached, learning how to give the right answers without investing belief, how to perform understanding without allowing it to touch their sense of self, while others choose a different path altogether, stepping back emotionally and mentally, refusing to offer their attention to a structure that feels more interested in control than comprehension. This refusal often goes unnoticed because it does not disrupt efficiency. Yet internally, it marks a decisive shift, a moment when learning is no longer perceived as a collaborative process, but as a transaction in which attention is exchanged for approval and for minds that value authenticity. This exchange feels deeply unbalanced. Over time, authority itself becomes associated with limitation rather than guidance, and knowledge presented through authoritative structures begins to feel suspect, not because it lacks value, but because it arrives stripped of personal relevance, context, and emotional connection, turning ideas into obligations rather than tools for understanding the world. This is where school begins to lose credibility in the eyes of certain learners, not as an institution, but as a source of truth. Because when knowledge is enforced rather than discovered, it loses its vitality, becoming static, distant, and disconnected from lived experience. And once this perception takes hold, motivation erodes rapidly. The individual may still crave understanding, may still question deeply, but they begin to seek these experiences elsewhere, away from classrooms and curricula, gravitating toward spaces where authority feels earned rather than imposed, where ideas are explored rather than delivered, and where thinking is not immediately evaluated, but allowed to evolve naturally. By this stage, the refusal to learn from school is no longer accidental or passive, but quietly intentional, a psychological boundary drawn not out of hostility, but out of self-respect, because continuing to engage would require a level of submission that feels incompatible with one's inner sense of autonomy. This boundary does not announce itself loudly, and it is rarely recognized as such from the outside. Yet, it fundamentally reshapes the individual's relationship with formal education, authority figures, and structured knowledge, creating a lasting skepticism toward systems that prioritize control over curiosity. Long after the classroom is left behind, this skepticism often remains, influencing how rules are interpreted, how guidance is received, and how trust is extended, leaving behind not a hatred of learning, but a deeply ingrained wariness of any environment that asks for obedience before understanding. At some point, as formal learning grows increasingly distant, something quietly shifts that is often mistaken for loss, when, in reality, it is redirection, because curiosity does not vanish, simply because school fails to contain it, but instead begins to move elsewhere, searching for spaces where it can exist without being measured, corrected, or rushed. And this movement happens gradually, almost invisibly, long before anyone recognizes it as learning at all. For these individuals, curiosity becomes private, detached from institutions and external validation, unfolding in moments that are rarely announced or shared, appearing late at night while reading something unrelated to school, during long walks where thoughts wander freely, through films, music, conversations, or solitary observation, where ideas connect not because they are required to, but because something inside recognizes relevance and meaning. This form of learning feels fundamentally different from classroom instruction, because it is not driven by obligation or reward, but by resonance, by the subtle internal signal that something matters. And once this signal is felt, attention follows naturally, sometimes obsessively, without the need for discipline or structure imposed from the outside. What makes this redirection difficult to recognize is that it lacks visible markers of progress, no grades, no timelines, no certificates, and without these signals, the surrounding world often assumes stagnation, interpreting quiet exploration as inactivity and unstructured curiosity as a lack of ambition, even though internally the mind may be deeply engaged, forming connections that feel far more alive than anything previously encountered in school. In this private landscape, learning becomes nonlinear, moving in spirals rather than steps, circling around ideas, revisiting them from different angles, allowing understanding to deepen slowly over time without the pressure to arrive quickly or conclusively. And for many, this is the first time learning feels natural rather than forced, fluid rather than rigid. Yet this freedom also carries isolation, because curiosity pursued outside recognized systems often lacks language, community, or legitimacy, leaving the individual unsure how to explain what they are learning, or even whether it counts as learning at all. And this uncertainty can create a quiet tension between internal fulfillment and external expectation. Friends, family, and authority figures may continue to ask familiar questions about progress, plans, and outcomes, questions shaped by conventional definitions of success. And each time these questions arise, the individual is reminded that their way of learning exists largely outside shared understanding, making it difficult to articulate its value without feeling defensive or misunderstood. As a result, curiosity retreats further inward, not because it weakens, but because it has learned that exposure invites judgment, and judgment threatens the fragile sense of autonomy that makes learning possible in the first place, reinforcing the pattern of silent exploration and internal validation. Over time, this inward learning begins to shape identity in subtle ways, fostering a sense of independence and self-reliance, but also cultivating doubt. Because without external confirmation, the individual must constantly negotiate their own sense of legitimacy, questioning whether what they know is enough, whether it is real, and whether it will ever translate into something recognizable by the world. This tension often leads to a complex relationship with structure, where the individual both craves and resists it, longing for guidance that does not constrain, for direction that does not dominate, and for communities that value depth over performance, a balance that is difficult to find and rarely modeled. What is rarely acknowledged is that this form of learning often produces a different kind of understanding, one that is deeply integrated, emotionally grounded, and personally meaningful, but also difficult to extract, quantify, or explain, because it is woven into perception rather than stored as information. These individuals may struggle to recall facts on demand or perform under evaluation, yet they often demonstrate a nuanced grasp of ideas when allowed to speak freely, drawing connections across domains, sensing patterns others overlook, and approaching problems from angles that feel intuitive rather than procedural. However, because these abilities develop outside formal systems, they are frequently dismissed or overlooked, reinforcing the belief that school was never meant to recognize this kind of intelligence, and that continued engagement would only require further compromise of authenticity. As adulthood approaches, this divergence becomes more pronounced, as the gap between institutional expectations and internal orientation widens, forcing the individual to confront practical realities while trying to preserve the fragile relationship they have built with learning on their own terms. Some attempt to return to formal education, hoping to reconcile these differences, while others move further away, investing their energy in work, creativity, or self-directed study that allows for autonomy, even if it comes at the cost of security or recognition. In either case, the legacy of school remains present, shaping how learning is approached, how authority is negotiated, and how worth is measured, leaving behind a persistent awareness that curiosity thrives, not where it is demanded, but where it is invited. By this stage, the refusal to learn from school is no longer about rejection or resistance, but about loyalty. A quiet commitment to protecting the conditions under which curiosity remains alive, even if those conditions exist outside accepted definitions of education. And so, learning continues, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, carried forward by a mind that has learned through absence and misalignment, where it cannot grow, and through careful redirection, where it still can. As time passes and the separation from school solidifies, the psychological focus quietly shifts inward, away from curiosity and authority, and toward identity, because prolonged misalignment does not remain a situational experience for long, but gradually becomes a personal narrative, shaping how individuals see themselves in relation to intelligence, effort, and worth, often without ever consciously choosing that story. In environments where learning is constantly compared, ranked, and exposed, the absence of visible success does not remain neutral, because even silence is interpreted. And over time, the individual begins to absorb the idea that being unseen is not merely unfortunate, but indicative, suggesting something lacking rather than something different. And this implication settles deeply, long before it is examined. Comparison operates quietly in these spaces, not always through explicit competition, but through subtle cues, through praise directed elsewhere, through speed being rewarded, through confidence being mistaken for understanding. And as these signals accumulate, the individual begins to measure themselves against standards that were never designed to reflect how they think, creating a persistent sense of falling behind without ever knowing exactly where the race is headed. This sense of lag does not always feel dramatic or painful at first, but more like a low-grade unease, a constant background awareness that others seem to move with ease through a system that feels dense and resistant. And over time, this awareness hardens into assumption, the assumption that difficulty must reflect inadequacy, and that effort that does not yield recognition must reflect deficiency. Shame enters quietly here, not as humiliation, but as self-monitoring, as a heightened awareness of being evaluated, of being potentially exposed as insufficient. And once this awareness takes root, behavior begins to shift. Participation becomes cautious, expression becomes restrained, and silence becomes a strategy rather than an accident. The individual learns how to minimize risk, how to avoid situations where their thinking might be misunderstood or judged prematurely, and this self-protection, while adaptive in the short term, gradually narrows the space in which learning can safely occur, reinforcing the belief that engagement itself carries danger. Over time, the internal narrative begins to change, no longer centered on the system's limitations, but on the self's perceived failures. Because when misalignment persists without explanation, the mind searches for coherence, and the most accessible explanation is often personal inadequacy, a conclusion that feels both painful and oddly stabilizing, because it provides a reason, even if it is a damaging one. This is how identity quietly forms around absence, around what one is not, rather than what one is, shaping a self-image that feels incomplete, hesitant, or fundamentally incompatible with formal learning, even when intellectual curiosity and depth remain intact beneath the surface. What makes this process especially insidious is that it rarely involves explicit condemnation, because no one needs to say, "You are not smart," for the message to be received. As long as opportunities consistently bypass the individual, as long as effort remains invisible, and as long as recognition flows elsewhere, the conclusion draws itself. As this identity settles, learning becomes emotionally charged, no longer neutral, because every attempt now carries the weight of self-evaluation, transforming mistakes into confirmations and challenges into threats. And under these conditions, refusal begins to feel like relief, a way to escape a cycle that repeatedly reinforces doubt. The individual may begin to distance themselves, not only from school, but from any context that resembles evaluation, avoiding situations where competence must be demonstrated publicly, and gravitating instead toward spaces where identity feels less contingent on performance, even if those spaces offer less structure or recognition. This avoidance is often misunderstood as a lack of ambition, yet internally it is driven by a desire to preserve dignity, because repeated exposure to comparison without context erodes self-trust, and without self-trust, effort becomes emotionally unsustainable. At the same time, the individual may develop a heightened sensitivity to others' judgments, becoming acutely aware of how intelligence is perceived, valued, and rewarded, which can lead to cynicism, skepticism, or detachment, depending on temperament, further distancing them from systems that appear to reduce complex minds to simple metrics. In some cases, this sensitivity evolves into a quiet resilience, a refusal to define oneself through external measures. But in others, it hardens into self-doubt, limiting risk-taking and narrowing the scope of exploration, because curiosity, once again, must negotiate safety before it can move freely. As adolescence and early adulthood unfold, this identity continues to influence decisions, shaping educational paths, career choices, and relationships with authority, often in ways that feel instinctive rather than deliberate, as if the body remembers what the mind has learned to avoid. The refusal to learn from school at this stage is no longer about rejection or resistance, but about self-concept, about protecting an already fragile sense of competence from further erosion. And this protection, while understandable, carries long-term consequences because it constrains where learning is allowed to happen. Yet even here, beneath layers of comparison and shame, the desire to understand does not disappear, but waits, cautious and guarded, for conditions that feel safe enough to allow re-engagement without threatening identity, suggesting that the relationship with learning is not broken, but paused. This pause is often misread as finality, but in truth, it reflects a deep psychological negotiation between curiosity and self-worth, one that cannot be resolved through pressure or instruction, but only through environments that separate learning from judgment and allow intelligence to re-emerge without needing to prove itself first. By the end of this stage, the individual carries not only memories of school, but an internalized map of where they feel competent, exposed, or safe. A map that will quietly guide future encounters with knowledge long after formal education has ended. As adulthood gradually takes shape, the legacy of school does not disappear with distance or age, but instead reappears in quieter, more complex forms, because the way a person first learned to relate to knowledge, authority, and self-worth rarely stays confined to classrooms, instead migrating into work, relationships, ambition, and the private conversations one has with oneself when deciding whether something feels worth attempting at all. For many who disengaged early, adulthood brings an odd contradiction, a growing awareness of capability paired with a persistent hesitation to place that capability in structured environments. Because while experience may have proven that the mind is capable of depth, adaptation, and insight, the emotional memory of evaluation still lingers, subtly shaping which opportunities feel inviting and which feel threatening. This is often where patterns repeat without being recognized, as workplaces begin to resemble classrooms in unexpected ways, through performance reviews, hierarchies, deadlines, and implicit standards of competence, triggering familiar responses of withdrawal, quiet resistance, or strategic detachment, even when the individual is no longer constrained by the same rules or powerless in the same ways. The refusal here is more nuanced, less visible, expressed not through absence, but through selective engagement, through doing only what feels necessary, avoiding roles that demand constant self-presentation, and steering away from environments where worth feels conditional on visibility rather than contribution. At the same time, many of these individuals continue learning intensely on their own terms, acquiring skills, insights, and understanding through experience, experimentation, and self-directed exploration, often surpassing peers in areas that align with their internal motivation, yet remaining reluctant to claim authority or expertise publicly, because claiming such space still feels emotionally unsafe. This creates a peculiar tension, where competence exists alongside self-doubt, and ability coexists with restraint, leading others to underestimate the individual's depth, while the individual themselves may underestimate the legitimacy of what they know, having internalized the belief that knowledge only counts when sanctioned by recognized systems. As years pass, this internal conflict can manifest as restlessness, a sense of being underutilized or misaligned, not because of a lack of opportunity, but because opportunities that require conformity, constant evaluation, or hierarchical submission feel psychologically expensive, draining energy rather than offering growth. Some attempt to override this discomfort by forcing themselves into traditional paths, believing that endurance will eventually lead to acceptance, yet often finding that the same patterns resurface, the same fatigue, the same sense of performing rather than participating, reinforcing the belief that something fundamental remains unresolved. Others move in the opposite direction, rejecting structure almost entirely, gravitating toward freelance work, creative fields, or solitary pursuits that offer autonomy. Yet this freedom can come with instability, isolation, and the ongoing pressure of self-validation, because without external frameworks, the individual must continually define success for themselves. In both cases, the shadow of school persists, not as a memory of specific events, but as a template for how learning and authority are expected to interact, influencing decisions in ways that feel instinctive rather than reasoned, as if the body remembers what the mind has learned to avoid. Relationships are not immune to this influence either, because conversations involving advice, correction, or guidance can trigger defensiveness or withdrawal, especially when they resemble the one-directional flow of instruction experienced in school, making collaboration feel precarious and misunderstanding more likely. At the same time, many develop a heightened sensitivity to authenticity, valuing relationships and environments where knowledge is shared rather than imposed, where questioning is welcomed rather than controlled, and where competence is demonstrated through presence and insight rather than credentials or titles. This sensitivity can become a strength, allowing the individual to recognize meaningful learning spaces when they appear, often later in life, through mentors, communities, or experiences that operate outside traditional hierarchies, offering the first taste of what learning can feel like when it is grounded in respect rather than evaluation. Yet, approaching these spaces is rarely easy, because re-engagement requires vulnerability, the willingness to risk misunderstanding again. And, for someone whose identity was shaped by avoidance as protection, this risk feels significant even when the potential reward is growth. As a result, re-entry into structured learning, whether through formal education, training, or collaborative environments, often happens slowly, cautiously, negotiated step by step, as trust is rebuilt not only in others, but in one's own ability to participate without being diminished. What becomes clear in adulthood is that the refusal to learn from school was never a rejection of learning itself, but a response to conditions that made learning feel unsafe. And once those conditions change, curiosity begins to surface again, though often with hesitation, carrying the memory of past misalignment. This realization can be both liberating and unsettling, because it challenges long-held beliefs about identity, intelligence, and limitation, forcing the individual to reconsider narratives that once felt stable, even if painful, and to confront the possibility that disengagement was contextual rather than inherent. For some, this leads to a gradual reintegration of learning into life, not through institutions, but through projects, questions, and collaborations that feel personally meaningful, allowing intelligence to express itself without needing permission. For others, the divide remains, not because of incapacity, but because the emotional cost of re-engagement feels too high, reinforcing a life pattern where learning is compartmentalized, pursued privately, but avoided publicly. Either way, adulthood reveals the long arc of early educational experiences, showing how subtle psychological patterns can echo across decades, shaping not only what people learn, but how willing they are to be seen learning. By this stage, the story is no longer about school itself, but about reconciliation, about whether the individual can separate the act of learning from the structures that once constrained it, and whether curiosity can be reclaimed without reopening old wounds. The answer is rarely simple or immediate, but the possibility exists quietly, in moments where understanding feels expansive rather than evaluative, suggesting that the relationship with learning is not fixed, but waiting, patient and unresolved, for conditions that finally allow it to breathe. At a certain point, often later than expected, and rarely announced clearly, the relationship with learning begins to loosen its old shape, not because the past has been resolved, but because distance has created space, and within that space a different question quietly forms, one that no longer asks whether school was right or wrong, but whether learning itself must remain bound to the conditions under which it was first encountered. This question does not arrive with confidence, but with hesitation, because for those who learn to protect themselves by withdrawing, any return toward learning carries the risk of reopening patterns that once caused harm, yet the question persists, surfacing in moments of curiosity that refuse to stay dormant, moments when understanding feels necessary rather than optional. What begins to change here is not behavior, but perception, as learning slowly separates from institutions, grades, authority figures, and comparisons, becoming less of a performance and more of an internal movement, something that happens quietly, unevenly, and without the need for validation, allowing curiosity to exist without immediately being judged. This shift is subtle, because it does not resemble the enthusiasm often associated with learning, but rather a cautious willingness to remain present with questions that do not demand immediate answers, a tolerance for not knowing that feels safer now than it once did, because identity is no longer entirely dependent on external approval. In this space, learning becomes less about accumulation and more about orientation, about how attention is directed, what feels worth noticing, and which questions feel alive enough to sustain engagement over time, even without structure or reward. For many, this reorientation involves revisiting subjects once abandoned, not to master them, but to encounter them differently, without pressure to perform or succeed, allowing understanding to unfold at its own pace, guided by relevance rather than obligation. Others discover learning through practice rather than theory, through making, building, experimenting, and failing privately, where mistakes do not threaten identity, and understanding emerges through contact rather than explanation, offering a sense of agency that was once missing. What matters here is not the form learning takes, but the conditions under which it occurs, conditions that prioritize psychological safety, autonomy, and meaning, because without these, curiosity cannot sustain itself, regardless of intelligence or motivation. As this new relationship develops, it often coexists uneasily with the old one, creating moments of tension where enthusiasm collides with doubt, where interest is followed by withdrawal, and where progress is interrupted by old reflexes that still associate learning with exposure and judgment. These interruptions are not failures, but echoes, reminders of how deeply early experiences shape internal responses, and recognizing them without self-criticism becomes part of the process, allowing movement forward without demanding erasure of the past. Gradually, learning begins to feel less like a test and more like a conversation, one that can pause, resume, and change direction without consequence, offering a sense of continuity rather than pressure. And in this continuity, confidence begins to rebuild, not as certainty, but as trust in one's ability to engage without being diminished. This trust does not require formal recognition to exist, though for some, it eventually leads back into structured environments, approached differently now, with clearer boundaries and a stronger sense of agency, while for others, it remains firmly rooted in informal spaces that feel more aligned with how understanding naturally unfolds. What becomes clear is that the refusal to learn from school was never a final statement, but a temporary strategy, a way of preserving curiosity when conditions made it unsafe. And once those conditions change, even internally, the strategy can soften without disappearing entirely. Learning, in this sense, is revealed not as a trait or achievement, but as a relationship, one that evolves, fractures, withdraws, and repairs itself over time, shaped less by content than by context, less by ability than by trust. This understanding reframes the past without needing to excuse or condemn it, allowing the individual to hold complexity without resolution, acknowledging both the harm and the adaptation it required, without reducing either to a simple narrative. As the relationship with learning continues to shift, it becomes possible to imagine futures not defined by avoidance or resistance, but by selective engagement, by choosing where and how understanding is pursued, rather than accepting predetermined paths. This choice does not guarantee ease or recognition, but it offers coherence, aligning curiosity with identity in a way that no longer requires constant defense. And in this alignment, learning regains its vitality, not as an obligation, but as an expression of being alive and attentive in the world. By the end of this movement, there is no resolution in the conventional sense, no lesson neatly extracted, no closure imposed, because the story does not end here, but continues wherever curiosity finds conditions gentle enough to remain present. And perhaps this is the quiet truth beneath the refusal to learn from school, that learning was never rejected, only postponed, waiting patiently for a place where it could exist without being asked to disappear in order to belong.